right, we're about 3 minutes past the hour, so I will formally begin us for today's event. Thank you all for joining us for today's ongoing series, The Holocaust as an Interdisciplinary Tapestry. Classrooms Without Borders, in coordination with Tali Nates, the founder and executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Maydeen Shahar, director of Talking Memory online lecture series and international educational programs from the Ghetto Fighters House, and Esther Toprek, finder, member of the GSI Coordinating Council, Generations of the Shoah International, and in partnership with Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Research Center and Education Center of Florida, is delighted to have you today for our series. Today's session will focus in on Holocaust cinema, how a film unfinished questions archival footage, featuring Annette Insdorf. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. We are very thankful for all your support over the years, and most especially these past 3 years of navigating our expanded presence for CWB, while also supporting our robust offerings. Over the past 3 years alone, we have offered over 446 virtual programs with close to 75,000 participants, reaching almost 60 countries and most of the states in the USA. If you'd like to make a donation to support our organization, we'll drop it in the chat for you in just a moment. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's moderator, Tali Nates. Tali is the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. She is a historian who lectures internationally on Holocaust and genocide education, memory, reconciliation, and human rights. She was born to a family of Holocaust survivors. Her father and uncle were saved by Oskar Schindler. I will drop her more extensive bio in the chat in just a moment. Please send all your questions directly to me in the chat, and we will try our best to answer them all. I will now turn the camera over to Esther, who is a member of the GSI Coordinating Council, Generations of the Shoah International. She will say a few words of welcome before Tali introduces our guest for today. With that, Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you. When I was first thinking about this interdisciplinary look at the Holocaust, I had Annette Insdorf in mind. The Tapestry series is lucky to have Annette share her expertise in films, especially Holocaust films. Tali will give us a more complete introduction in a moment, but I wanted to make a generic comment first. Film is an interesting medium. Audiences vary, and everyone brings their personal experiences and expectations to a screening, but Annette has insights that most of us don't have. I am always captivated when she speaks and learn so much from her presentations. For those of you who have never met her, you are in for a very special treat. And full disclosure, Annette is a member of my family.
Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you, Ellen. And welcome, warm welcome. First of all, I see Holocaust survivors joining us live and wanted to acknowledge, it's always amazing to have you with us. I see many second generation and third generations, teachers, academics, and just friends that are joining us for this really intriguing series that we started in February. And we started with psychiatry, and we moved to law and justice, and we moved to cultural history and how do we remember. And today, of course, we are honored to go and look at films. And more than anything, as someone that created the museum, that created probably 30 films for the museum, I'm curious to learn from our esteemed speaker today about films, but films done by the generations after the survivors, the second, the third, and so on. And with that in mind, we have an amazing scholar, Professor Annette Insdorf, who is a professor of film at Columbia University School of the Arts. And of course, she is also a moderator of the popular Real Pieces series at Manhattan's 92nd Y. where she has interviewed almost 300 film celebrities. The stories that you have for us, Annette, I'm sure are absolutely unbelievable. Annette is also an author. Please have a look when you see Annette. She is showing some of her books as well. And I hope that you managed to watch the two films that Annette will speak about, a film Unfinished and Numbered. The film Numbered will be available for viewing for another at least 24 hours. So if you did not watch it, please make sure to try and watch it. Annette, the floor is yours, and we will continue with the discussion and a Q&A after your contribution.
Thank you very much, everyone. And I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to address something that is very close to my heart, film and the Holocaust in general, and the efforts of now the third generation in particular. I have noticed that many Holocaust-related movies from the 1970s through the 90s were directed by 2G, children of survivors. Increasingly, I am seeing the cinematic efforts of the third generation, and this is particularly intriguing in Israeli films. The Shoah was rarely foregrounded in Israeli movies between 1950 and 2000. Not surprising for a country forging an identity of strength rather than victimhood. But in the 21st century, the subject is being explored on screen. For me, the most riveting of these Israeli documentaries are Numbered from 2012 and a film Unfinished made 2 years earlier. I remember in 2012, just when it seemed like the Holocaust film genre had been exhausted and there was no new Shoah subject matter, Numbered premiered at the Jerusalem Film Festival. This documentary was fresh, moving, illuminating, and beautifully made. It went on to win the documentary prize at the Chicago Film Festival. And this movie's point of departure is the tattoo of Auschwitz survivors, an indelible mark on the arm that is increasingly less recognizable to younger generations. Numbered does not allow for generalization, as each survivor views his or her mark differently. Partly because it is also about the process of recording, Numbered is a significant contribution to the question of how to represent survivors. It's not only moving, but honest. For example, we hear the whir of the camera, always aware of the process of recording, of photographing the survivors' faces and taping their verbal stories. It's aesthetically rich in its juxtapositions of stills and motion pictures, of black and white and color, of lyrically repetitive piano music with harsh history, close-ups of faces of survivors, and verbal recollections. Co-director Dana Doron said that she wanted a kaleidoscopic feeling, quote, a big crystal that shines from all angles, unquote. The incorporation of second and third generation is crucial to the film. For example, we meet a woman named Hannah who feels that she should have a tattoo as well as what her father had. And we meet the grandson of a Greek survivor who gets a tattoo so that he won't forget the Holocaust. Number does not allow for generalization, as each survivor is different, unique. A film Unfinished is the other riveting documentary I want to discuss today from 2010. It inserts itself into a rich tradition of Holocaust cinema. I find it significant for at least 4 reasons. Its perspective is female, third generation, Israeli, and fourth, the film is striking in terms of its style. As in Alain René's Night and Fog from 1955, archival footage is merely the point of departure for a contemporary interrogation of recorded images and their veracity. Yael Hersonsky's first feature-length film has a formal richness in the service of creating awareness. If it begins with the camera tracking forward into a corridor, The archival footage has the camera moving in a vital counterpoint from depth towards the screen. A film unfinished, like the camera tracking through it, actively penetrates space and time. It's a restless inquiry into the truth as well as the deception of documentary representation. Director Yael Hersonsky reveals the manipulations inherent in the footage of the Warsaw Ghetto taken by Nazis throughout May of 1942. We hear reenactments in Polish of the diary voice of Adam Czerniakow, the ghetto's Jewish council leader. We hear German reports about the filming in the ghetto from the only known cameraman, Willy Wist. And we meet ghetto survivors in an Israeli screening room reacting to the flickering images reflected on their faces. The juxtapositions are bracing. For example, Czerniakov's voiceover speaks of imminent deportation, while we see a staged scene of ghetto Jews dancing at a ball. This narrative strategy is appropriate to what Hersonsky called the battle for the narrative. The filmmaker incorporates various forms of documenting, whether written journals of Jews in the ghetto, Nazi cameras, close-ups of the typewriter keys for German reports, or the film's own female voiceover narration. One can appreciate that this cinematic inquiry might be personal. Hersonsky's grandmother was imprisoned in the Warsaw Ghetto, but its wide-ranging importance lies in its objective questioning of images. It makes a necessary distinction between reality, that which is recorded, and truth, which often eludes the frame. Even if it seems like there's nothing new to say about the Holocaust, at least cinematically, young Israeli filmmakers are exploring the subject in ways that are original, stylistically rich, and philosophically meaningful. I find Numbered and A Film Unfinished deeply connected. They're not simply Israeli documentaries about the Holocaust. Both explore the traces that remain from the early 1940s. They offer a glance backward, anchored in evidence, whether that evidence is a tattooed arm or archival footage. First, in terms of Numbered, I should say that when I was writing the second update of my book, Indelible Shadows, Film in the Holocaust, that's the third update, I came across one documentary and two fiction films of note from Israel. Because of that war, a documentary from 1988 was directed by Orna Ben-Dor-Niv, a child of survivors. It was for the Israeli Film Service, focused on a popular rock duo whose songs are rooted in their parents' Holocaust experiences. Its point of departure is a record album called Ashes and Dust. The film traces how singer-composer Yehuda Poliker and lyricist-producer Yaakov Gilad transform Holocaust stories, as well as childhood memories and fears, into art. 1 year earlier, in 1987, director Tzipi Tropé made Tel Aviv, Berlin. This fictional drama develops a similar theme through the tormented character of Benjamin, a Berlin Jew who escaped from Auschwitz and ended up in Tel Aviv. He marries Leah, a rather plain woman who came to Israel from Poland before the war, and they have a daughter. But Benjamin's German roots become increasingly palpable in the late 1940s, creating a tension between cultural and religious identity. He becomes obsessed with two people who represent his past. Beautiful Gusti is also an Auschwitz survivor from Berlin, and Jacob Miller is a former concentration camp capo. Benjamin is so irresistibly drawn to loving Gusti and to killing Miller that he virtually abandons his wife and child. His ineradicable Berlin identity, a class difference expressed by his wearing a hat and bow tie or listening to German music, That overwhelms his adopted Israeli identity. But at the end of the film, when he confronts Miller with a gun, director Tropez implies that it liberates Benjamin to some extent from his ghosts and that he might return to his wife. Tel Aviv, Berlin is not only one of the extremely rare Israeli films to deal with the Holocaust at that time, it's also one of the few Holocaust fiction dramas directed by a woman. Oh, I have to warn you, they're doing some construction in an apartment next to mine. Occasionally, you may hear some drilling, for which I apologize. But back to Tel Aviv, Berlin, Tropez acknowledged that the story is loosely based on her own parents. As the title suggests, this compelling psychological portrait locates within the protagonist the conflict between two cities. They represent not only past and future, but an assimilated cultural identity versus anonymity among other Jews. Many Holocaust dramas have presented the survivor as emotionally damaged. Even an internationally respected Israeli film like The Summer of Avia from 1990 falls into a trap of stereotyping. The semi-autobiographical novel of the Israeli actress Gila Almagor was the basis for her screenplay, co-written with Chaim Buzaglo and Eli Cohen, the film's director. She also stars as Henya. This moving drama of the tense relationship between a survivor mother and a young daughter is told from the perspective of the now grown Avia. She narrates how the summer of 1951, when she was 10, began with the mother, Almagor, attending her boarding school play. The effect of the presence of Henya, a survivor who has been in mental hospitals since the war's end, is to render Avia suddenly mute. When her mother discovers lice on her, she takes Avia home and brutally snips off all her hair, making her look like a concentration camp inmate. The bald daughter of the crazy partizanka, as Henya is called, well, she's ostracized. By the end, Henya's mental condition deteriorates, and Aviva must return to boarding school. In the background of this film is the lack of understanding that Holocaust survivors encountered from other Israelis. By 1995, Eli Cohen directed Under the Domim Tree, the sequel to The Summer of Avia, again adapted from Gila Almagor's novel and script. This Israeli drama traces Avia's coming of age in a state-run boarding school. The same actresses play out the continuing tension. Henya is in a psychiatric hospital, but the focus shifts to Avia's friend Mira. This abused orphan is claimed by a couple as their daughter, but she refuses to have anything to do with them. They go on trial, and just as the judge is about to order Mira to return to them, she remembers her real name and family. The adjustment is difficult for her as well as the other Polish Jewish orphans, but the film's central metaphor suggests optimism. Their beloved gardener Vim has planted tulips under the Domim tree, despite the assumption that nothing can grow there. The last scene, of course, shows the flourishing tulips in the hard land, an image of regeneration that is, among other things, an antidote to Henya's hospitalization. When I interviewed the great documentary director Aviva Kempner, she said that Israeli cinema has an even more egregious stereotyping. And I'm quoting her, "Although The Summer of Avia is a brilliant film, I was disturbed to learn that Gila Almagor's mother was not, in fact, a survivor. Can't someone go insane without being a victim of the Holocaust? It's even worse in The Wooden Gun," continued the producer of films like Partisans of Vilna. She's, I think, quite perceptive in saying the following. In this Israeli film, kids make fun of a survivor who is a ranting madwoman. I find this insidious. Part of the motivating factor in making Partisans of Vilna was to offer examples of survivors who clearly went on to normal lives after the war. They talk about that time without going into tears or a catatonic state. The stories of survivors becoming crazy or committing suicide might be the most dramatic, but for me, the greatest drama is in how survivors like my mother and her friends created new lives despite the horror they suffered during the war, unquote. It is no surprise that Israeli films in particular have tended to reinforce the cliche. In the new state that was creating a heroic, future-oriented self-image, discussion of the Holocaust was avoided, and survivors were not encouraged to tell their tales. An article entitled Circle of Pain in the magazine Inside Out in 2000 tells of a study that was done at Hadassah University Hospital in Jerusalem. And I'm going to quote, "Scientists have done it again. They've launched an elaborate study to confirm what we've already known for several decades, that the experience of the Holocaust didn't end with its survivors, but was handed down to their children like an unwanted heirloom, causing extreme vulnerability to emotional distress," unquote. It's Aviva Potts who's writing. Published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the study of Israeli second-generation members diagnosed with breast cancer found that, quote, "the children of Holocaust survivors scored much higher on tests for depression, anxiety, hostility, and negative feelings than patients in the control group," unquote. Curiously, the author does not make a crucial point that is obvious from one of her examples. Quote, "her parents never talked about their experiences, but somehow Michaela knew they suffered from an inconsolable anguish," unquote. If there is trauma for the child of the Holocaust survivor, isn't it more likely to come from silence than from genealogy, from secrecy rather than awareness? Well, this is the background for Numbered from 2012. Co-directors Dana Doron and Uriel Sinai had never made a film before. Sinai is an Israeli photojournalist. Doron is a medical doctor. The film originated in the emergency room when Doron was taking blood from a woman with a tattoo on her arm. And when Doron asked what were her symptoms, she simply held out her arm. And Doron said it felt like ashes from Auschwitz were on her flesh. Later, her daughter arrived and apologized, saying that her mother often goes to the ER when she needs to talk. Doron's grandmother was a Holocaust survivor who died when she was 8. Once she and Sinai got a Canon camera, they worked nights and weekends. The film took 3 years of research and shooting. Sinai insisted on doing black and white portraits on film with an old camera, for which it was hard to buy stock. And when they began doing the portraits in 2009, they figured there were maybe 50 survivors with tattoos in Israel. Later, they learned that there were about 5,000 in Israel and 10,000 in the world. But by 2012, there were only 2,000. And of course, the number has diminished in the past 10 years. For example, the character, the feisty shopper Zoka, she died in 2012. Numbered begins with printed lines of a survivor vis-a-vis his tattoo, reminding us all that in the beginning is the word. And the last line is followed by a number, which turns out to be from the famed Italian writer Primo Levi. The line is, "With time, my tattoo has become a part of my body. I do not display and I do not hide it. I show it unwillingly to those who ask out of curiosity, readily and with anger to those who say they are incredulous. Often young people ask me why I don't have it erased. This surprises me. Why should I? There are not many of us in the world to bear this witness," unquote. And then in Numbered, we see black and white stills of these elderly individuals. Color enters when each survivor identifies himself by number, and the lyrical music of Isar Schulman sets a wistful tone. Auschwitz and its subcamps were the only camps to tattoo prisoners beginning in the fall of 1941. Approximately 400,000 serial numbers were printed, mainly on left arms. This is a bit personal for me because I can't forget that my mother's own number was A22971. Only prisoners selected for forced labor were assigned tattoos. Those who were sent directly to the gas chambers were not. And I always assumed that A meant Auschwitz and B meant Birkenau. But one of the survivors in the film says it was arbitrary, quote, "Nobody can explain the system. Some survivors have only numbers," unquote. Numbered includes amazing tales, such as 3 men with consecutive numbers, 4, 5, 7, shown together in the present. And actually, one number is missing. Doron said that he didn't want to appear. Also, the sisters, Hannah and Sarah, with consecutive numbers. It's touching from the very beginning to glimpse their arms crossed lovingly when posing. One vividly recalls the pain of seeing the other covered in lice and of taking from a dying girl's grip a beat that probably saved their lives. Also touching is Tzvi and his wife still kissing, recalling how she aggressively embraced him in a kibbutz. It was his first kiss and he fainted. What a spectrum of response these survivors have to their tattoos. The journalist Ruth Bondi had hers surgically removed at a time when the image of Holocaust survivors was uncomfortable. It was a country creating a mythology of heroism. The ironic Daniel sees it as a medal, a mark of celebrity and superiority. Zoka won't say the number in Hebrew, only in German. She also says that the number gave security because it meant that you could work. And later she recalls extending her inner arm so that the tattoo wouldn't be seen in the future. My mother's tattoo was also on her inner arm. Zoka was 16 when she was taken to Auschwitz. She's a widow whose son was severely injured in Israel's Yom Kippur War and says that she denies herself nothing. And the film follows her on that shopping spree before Holocaust Remembrance Day. There's also Gita, an endearing presence, whether apologizing for inadvertently making a face before the camera or singing a Serbian song. Later, the film accompanies her visit to the grave of her husband, Simo, who died in 2006. At the end of the film, when the survivors all hold up their arms, it feels like a salute. And Daniel says to raise the other arm or it might be seen as a Heil Hitler. Daniel is perhaps the most memorable character and the most public one. We see him visiting a class, watching a documentary about him and discussing it afterwards. During the Q&A, a student asks if joking is his way of coping with the past. Daniel dismisses this, emphasizing his happiness having children and grandchildren in Israel. As he puts it for me definitively, life is a one-way gift. Why let it go to waste? The final sequence of Numbered is overwhelming, reuniting the approximately 30 tattooed survivors for, quote, group portrait day. Doron said, ironically, that these 30 were, quote, our selection, unquote, those who had something new and fresh to say beyond what has been heard in Holocaust testimonies. I am still thinking about the second and third generation individuals who get tattoos in the film. The daughter Hannah and the grandson Ayal, they want a permanent mark to commemorate a loved one. But ironically enough, in Jewish law, a tattoo is considered a desecration of the body and is prohibited. If you haven't seen the film yet, I don't want to give you the spoiler, but just be aware that Hannah gets the wrong number tattoo and it's fixed on camera. And Dana Doron actually said the grandson Ayal was at the group portrait day when he discussed his tattoo with the survivors, it was like a lynching. The other survivors did not accept that a young person got a tattoo. The two sisters in the film have 5 children each. One son wanted to get the number tattooed. They said no. Instead, they got gold bracelets for all the children, each with the tattooed number inscribed. Doron added that the number tattooed on one's arm was meant to depersonalize, to erase your name. Quote, "We made it a point to see them as individuals," unquote. Indeed, if the survivors are introduced by first name and tattooed number, at the end, each is shown including the last name and no number. But for every story we hear, there are so many others we will not get to know. Okay, and I'm just going to say that the directors did not continue to make movies. Doron, since 2012, is working with patients who have severe head injuries and has been writing a script for a feature. Sinai continues to be a photographer as well as a cinematographer shooting documentaries. He was nominated in 2015 for a Pulitzer Prize as part of the New York Times team covering the war in Ukraine. In 2018, he co-wrote and co-directed an Israeli film called Wild, a documentary centered on decisions made by the chief caretaker of a wildlife hospital. But I'm going to quickly segue to a film Unfinished, which I see as part of a rich tradition in Holocaust cinema that juxtaposes archival footage with a poetically investigative style. A few films have risen to the challenge of using facts and figures in a creatively illuminating way. One of the best examples is Photographer, Foto Amator in Polish, made in 1998, Poland, directed by Dariusz Jablonski, who was the second assistant director for Krzysztof Kieślowski's Decalogue 10 years earlier, one of the most brilliant films I have ever seen. Photographer, it's a kaleidoscope in Polish, German, and Yiddish that yokes diverse visual and oral elements into a haunting exploration of at least 3 subjects. And those are the Lodz Ghetto during World War II, photography, and how we bear witness. Whereas most films about the Holocaust show the present in color and the past in black and white, Photographer reverses the strategy. The most vivid part is the past in color slides that were discovered in a Viennese bookstore in 1987. These 400 images, among the first ever made with color stock, were taken by Walter Gennewein, the Lodz Ghetto's chief accountant. He was an Austrian national appointed by the Nazis to ensure maximum productivity in this prison. From 1939 to 1944, the Lodz Ghetto was the largest work camp established by the Nazis for Poland's Jews. As many as 300,000 slave laborers for the Nazi war effort were imprisoned there at its peak. The focus of Yael Hersonsky's film Unfinished is footage taken of and within the Warsaw Ghetto rather than the Lodz Ghetto. She did extensive and intensive research for 2.5 years, tracking down material that surfaced long after 1945. For historical context, I read Ian Buruma's excellent essay, The Twisted Art of Documentary, published in the New York Review of Books in November 2010. He wrote the following, which I will quote directly. One of the things Bud Schulberg turned up in the fall of 1948 from an archive in Soviet-occupied Babelsberg, site of the famous UFA movie studios, was a 2-reel film shot by German cameramen in the Warsaw Ghetto. Presumably, this was from the same cache that was uncovered by East Germans less than 10 years later, part of an unfinished Nazi movie made in 1942 entitled Das Ghetto. The ghetto occupied less than 3% of the city land. Some 450,000 Jews were squeezed into filthy tenements, often without water, heat, or sanitation. By the time the ghetto was liquidated in April 1943, 100,000 had died of hunger and disease. That the movie had been made for propaganda purposes is clear, unquote. And by the way, this leads me to a PS, namely that a new documentary, Filmmakers for the Prosecution, has been released in early 2023, and it recounts how two American filmmakers rescued film evidence from destruction in order to convict the Nazis at the Nuremberg trial. These heroes were brothers Bud Schulberg and Stuart Schulberg, serving under the command of OSS film chief John Ford. Like a film unfinished, it explores the role of archival footage as historical witness. Yael Hersonsky's project began in 2006 after she wrote an essay about archives. She contacted the prominent Israeli producer Noemi Shori, who had completed a vast project for Yad Vashem that consisted of over 100 archive-based short films. Shori gave her a list of materials to watch, as well as a diary that was written inside the Warsaw Ghetto by a 15-year-old Jewish girl. It described, among other things, a Nazi film crew making a propaganda film inside the ghetto. A month later, Hersonsky traveled to the Yad Vashem Visual Center in Jerusalem to watch the 62-minute rough cut of the propaganda film. In her words, the effect was shocking. I interviewed her in April of 2011 when she recounted how 3 DVDs were handed to her in a dark Berlin bar under the table. She said she observed and absorbed the images till she could articulate her questions. The original texts and diaries were hard to track down because the translations changed. She filmed the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto first because she was afraid they might not remain alive. The film became an Israeli-German co-production, but the German producer was suspicious of her being too young. So Yael Hersonsky had to show a rough cut before she was allowed to finish shooting. There was a completely written screenplay, and she created storyboards from Googling images online. She had 3 rough cut screenings, of which the second was, in her opinion, a disaster, overloaded with too much material. The question raised was, whose story is it? The cameraman? The witnesses? So she kept a board with notes for every narrative, each in a different color, a collage that provided a visual model. And then there was the question of the soundtrack, about which she said, you need a musical guide working with silent footage to have a rhythm for the scene. And she used Philip Glass's repetitive, minimalist music in the first stages. She recalled that her original music score was rough, like glass scratching, and too intrusive. So with her composer and sound designer, she aimed for a soundtrack that was not realistic. Rather, as she put it, sound as a metaphor of sound, as she tried to maintain a distance between the viewer and the image. At times, a film unfinished leads us to dismiss the sequences staged by Nazis as mere propaganda. The inclusion of long-lost outtakes that weren't meant to be used is crucial, especially 3 staged takes of 2 boys in front of a butcher shop. And if you have ever seen the magnificent fiction film Korczak, directed by Andrzej Wajda in 1990, also set in the Warsaw Ghetto, the footage of Schultz's restaurant brings us back via obviously staged scenes of well-dressed Jews eating and drinking delicacies while a female performer dances and sings. In other words, if you've seen Korczak, you saw a fictionalized version of the cafe in the Warsaw Ghetto, but in a film unfinished, you see the actual location, but with staged scenes. At other moments, for example, when skin and bones slide down a chute in the mass graves towards the end, a film unfinished challenges us to look at the horrifying demise of Jewish victims. We're led to identify with the female survivor in the screening room, who covers her eyes when piles of corpses are shown on carts. And then she says, "Today I'm human, I can cry." I'm reminded of Daniel in the film Numbered, saying at the cemetery that he will be the first person in his family to be buried in a casket. About halfway through A Film Unfinished, we see the documentation of child smugglers forced to reveal the food hidden under their clothes. The term for these images is distressed footage. What could be more appropriate to the form and the content of the vulnerable images than distressed footage? After all, filmmakers can say, we shoot, process, filter. Isn't this also the language of destruction and indifference? Central to A Film Unfinished is an interview with Willie Wist, who was the cameraman and then questioned in a post-war court. The scenes with Wist are a reenactment. The bespectacled man that we glimpse only in fragments is the German actor Rüdiger Vogler. When he speaks of shooting a mountain of feces in a courtyard, we see a huge pile of garbage in the footage, and a survivor recalls it as well. The corroboration includes our ability to see SS cameramen in the background of shots in the ghetto, including Wist. On the one hand, the ghetto contains images that dehumanize Jews, some emaciated, others ears sticking out. On the other hand, it shows wealthy, well-fed Jews. Towards the end, you have these strange two shots of odd couples. For example, an elegant Jewish woman on the left, a woman in rags on the right. Germans filmed a circumcision, ritual baths, and how discomforting to see naked men and women forced to bathe, and an elaborate staged funeral, followed by a jarring cut to emaciated corpses lying in the street. It's especially difficult to look at child victims. For example, in color footage that was found as well, is a horrifying shot of two little boys in the street, one whose legs are like sticks. Hersonsky said to me the following: "Watching my own footage, I was scared of going blind," unquote. While watching A Film Unfinished a second or a third time, it led me to coin a word, authintensity, combining authenticity and intensity. And she also said to Ian Buruma, and I'm quoting, "What I'm fascinated by is how the Germans documented their own evil. That's fascinating to me because there's this cliche, a truthful one, about filmmaking as an act of observing, like a peeping Tom. It's not voyeurism, but standing there and staring," unquote. Fortunately, she interweaves the written testimony of firsthand witnesses, like Adam Cherniakow, whose vocabulary is an elegant pre-war Polish, and Emanuel Ringenblum, whose voiceover is in Yiddish. And if you want to see a related film that explores resistance through diary keeping, I recommend Who Will Write Our History? Roberta Grossman's 2019 film explores the Oyneg Shabbos Archive, a clandestine group led by Ringelblum in an effort to document the daily realities of the Warsaw Ghetto as seen by its Jewish prisoners. Ian Buruma made the point that we almost never see any Germans, but it's enough to glimpse the faces of people passing the camera full of terror and loathing to know that they are there. You may have noticed at the beginning of the film how men walking past the camera in the street take off their hats, acknowledging the camera. Now, I find it scandalous that A Film Unfinished was given an R rating by the MPAA for, quote, disturbing images of Holocaust atrocities, including graphic nudity, unquote. Hersonsky and her distributor fought the decision, asking the appeals board to consider the context of the nudity in the film in terms of its historical and educational importance, so that, among other things, it could be shown in schools. But the board upheld the decision, voting 12-3 in favor of the R rating. Now, I'm sorry, I can't resist. I was looking at the chat just now, and Ido Gilad wrote me a private message, but I think it's worth repeating in terms of Daniel. Daniel Hanoch from Numbered. He says, whom I visited yesterday and talked with 2 hours ago by phone, has another own film of his and his children called Pizza in Auschwitz. I'm actually aware of that film, but have never seen it. I did want to tell everybody, we're about to take questions in a moment, but there's a new documentary called 3 Minutes, A Lengthening. It was on the Oscars shortlist for documentary feature a few months ago. It is deeply connected to A Film Unfinished, and I recommend that you see it either on Hulu or Amazon Prime $2 rental. Directed by Bianca Stichter, it's informed by the book 3 Minutes in Poland, Discovering a Lost World in a 1938 Family Film, written by Glenn Kurtz. This evocative documentary is anchored in an amateur Kodachrome movie shot by David Kurtz in 1938. He returned from the United States to a Jewish town in Poland, 30 miles north of Warsaw. The voiceover of his grandson, Glenn Kurtz, who's watching, explains the detective work of identifying the town, Nashelsk. Mostly in color, these 3 minutes provide the only remnants of the Jewish residents of the town, of which only 100 survived the Holocaust. When we see the grainy, distressed footage again later, it's an objective correlative of the destruction of the individuals, as well as the vulnerability of the footage. Indeed, had Glenn not donated it to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in time, it would have been lost rather than restored and digitized. Now, I have many, many more points that I'm happy to make and discuss with you, but I think it would be frustrating for many of you if you did not have the opportunity to pose questions and have me address what may be of most interest to you.
So first of all, Annette, wow, amazing. So many people want, please, the list of all the films that you mentioned. So that is one task for you to make a list, which we will share with everyone. We have two amazing guests. One you discovered is with us, Glenn Kurtz, of course. And hello, Glenn. It's wonderful to have you, and your film and your book are important. And thank you, Annette, for mentioning.
I have to tell you, I had no idea that Glenn Kurtz was part of this event. I was just mentioning it because it's probably the best recent Holocaust-related documentary that I've seen.
Absolutely, and it's really fantastic. And Glenn, hello, a wonderful storyteller and a friend, and wonderful to have you here. And then I want to mention Pinchas Guter, who is here with us from Toronto, Canada. And Pinchas was a child in the Warsaw Ghetto. So also, when you spoke about A Film Unfinished, I was thinking about the scenes that Pinchas, of course, witnessed himself, but also Pinchas was involved in many films himself. So we do have at least two and many more that are trying to tell the story, generational story, from different angles. And wonderful to have you here. And maybe Glenn and Pinchas will say hello in a minute, but let's maybe start with some questions to you, Annette. And that is really important questions. Documentaries or feature films? What's the merit? You spoke about both Kite Shel Avia, Etz Adumim, and the documentaries. Can you speak about both and their merits or not?
Well, I think in my youth, like most of us, I assumed that fiction features were like Hollywood. They are fabricated, they are meant to be primarily entertainment, and that documentaries are like the short subjects we would watch in movie theaters when I was a child, something that would teach you a bit about history or about the world. It was like a social, civic thing. And the more I watched documentary features, feature length documentaries, the more I realized that whether it's the Holocaust or completely unrelated, I don't know, Michael Moore's Roger and Me, that you have to bring the same craft and the same goal of telling a vibrant story to the nonfiction medium as to the fiction medium. And for me, ultimately, the same values have to exist in the making and in the reception of the film. Namely, have the filmmakers found the most appropriate language to tell the story? Have they utilized the camera, the music, the soundtrack, the editing, in a way that is integral, organic with the material being presented? And yeah, I think most of us, if we have an evening off and we want to watch a movie, the likelihood is we're going to choose a fiction feature. We want to see actors. But increasingly, my husband, Mark, and I, when we have an evening off and we have a chance, and these days, of course, with Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime, I turned it into Amazon. We have the opportunity to see the best documentaries being made around the world. And invariably, we end up choosing a documentary because there's a subject we want to know more about, and the fiction movies we can see in the movie theaters.
And you spoke a little bit about, for example, Korczak in the film Unfinished. And I was thinking also about the pianists that have the scene of the cafe and the piano and so on. More and more, you have films that are covering different angles of certain stories. I'm thinking about Yaakov Gilad, the son of Halina Birnbaum, who with Yehuda Polike did the film that you mentioned, you started your talk with, and now he did another film, this time with his mother. Hard to believe, but the first time ever that he went to Poland with his mother. So I wonder if you can speak about films that are looking at the same scenes, or people revisiting and doing more than one film. And Pinchas, for example, did more than one film, or not him, more films were done about him, more than one film. Maybe you can discuss that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, for me, it's that old metaphor of peeling the onion. Any historical event, we will only know one layer when we first peel in terms of, say, written testimonies, archival material. But one of the questions raised by this brilliant Polish film photographer is how much there might be that we will never get to know directly 50 years later, 70 years later, 100 years later. And it becomes a challenge, especially, I think, for children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, to keep peeling the onion, to ask more questions, to understand what might have been left out, not simply for faulty memory, but because something that was uncomfortable for a parent to say to a child, well, maybe 30 years later, that detail can be revealed. I mean, my mother also, she would reveal things to me only in layers. I heard one version of things when I was a young teenager. By the time I was an adult, I learned more. The more horrific material was not told to me in my youth. So I think that even if a definitive film has, in quotes, definitive, been made about the Warsaw Ghetto, the Lodz Ghetto, I don't believe that. I think that every single testimony that has been recorded, let's say for the archives, the Shoah Foundation, for each one of them, there are 10 that were never recorded. There were stories that were never completely known. And some people have invented, some people have imagined, and some people have gone to source material to keep telling new versions of Holocaust-related stories.
Thank you. And maybe Jackie, in a few minutes, will allow Pinchas himself, if he's willing, to speak about this process of making a few films. I think everyone will be really interested and maybe just, share some thoughts. But because we have a lot of teachers with us, few are asking about using films and how to use films with high school learners or students. How do you use it? How do you navigate the stereotypes that are on display on many Holocaust films? What are your thoughts about it?
First of all, I think that the most vital, vibrant way to make younger people, students, aware of the Holocaust is through cinema. There's no question for me that that's an engagement tactic that seems to work better than books. And I mean, the average 15-year-old may not feel like reading The Diary of Anne Frank, but the very fact that we have a whole new Hulu miniseries, The Secret Room, I think it's called, which is focusing on Meat Geese. I have not seen it, but that is a story that keeps receiving cinematic treatment, including a film I have not yet seen. The great Israeli director Ari Folman, who made Waltz with Bashir, an animated feature, has done the same with the story of Anne Frank, but I do not believe it has been released in the United States yet. The question that I think is at the heart of yours: at what age do you introduce students to Holocaust material, and what kind of films can you show in high school versus in college? Now, I have a whole list of that. I mean, I might be able to access it in my on my laptop while you're speaking. There are certain films that are appropriate, in my opinion, for high school students. Perfect example. There is one opening in August called The White Bird, starring Helen Mirren. And it's the story of, essentially children during the Holocaust. And I call it Holocaust Light, L-I-T-E. But that's okay, because there are younger people who will learn about the subject through that film. In college, by the time that one is 18, 19, I believe that we should assume they are sufficiently adults. I mean, after all, these days, young people can see anything in the world on the internet. This is not like 20, 30 years ago when they weren't exposed to violence and atrocity as a daily thing. And I remember I showed Night and Fog when I first started teaching at Yale University, but this was around 1980, let's say. Students were horrified, they were shocked. The consciousness of the Holocaust, the cultural centrality of the Holocaust in the United States was not yet the case. So a few students cried, a few students I had to talk to afterwards. Now I show Night and Fog in my classes, and the students are familiar with the language, with the iconography of the Holocaust, with the template of trains and barbed wire. And I think it's, as long as you provide I hate the term trigger warning, but as long as you provide some sort of trigger warning for college students and beyond, telling them, be prepared. There is, footage of corpses. There's this. It is a way of not only creating awareness, but of creating sympathy, of triggering an emotional understanding of horrors that took place, which did exist, and whose impulses can be seen around the world still today. I mean, I consider the Holocaust a unique event, but I also see that its reverberations, its ramifications, can help contemporary young people guard against the ease of indifference.
There is an interesting question that then will open, and I'll invite if Glenn and Pinchas will be willing to join the conversation. I'm putting you both on the spot. I'm very, very sorry, but I hope that you are both willing to jump in. But Annette, a question about numbered, but also it's really beyond that. For example, in numbered, they only showed a certain age, a certain image of the survivor. There was no picture from before the number, when it was a human being without a number, and no pictures of a young man, no full story. It was really just one-sided. And, the question is, how are these decisions made? What are we losing out of the decisions? And then maybe I'll ask Pinchas and Glenn, because you had to make many decisions, those choices in those films. How do you make them? How do you go through to get to the complete film and see it as you spoke about a script, but a script that you are happy with. So maybe you can start, and Jackie, if you don't mind, to then bring Pinchas and Glenn into the conversation.
Two things that I think are crucial. In terms of survivors of Auschwitz, it would be ludicrous to assume that all of them have photographs of themselves before the war. The thing that I believe my mother suffered from most in her life, her mother, my grandmother, died in Bergen-Belsen 11 days before the liberation. So my mother was devastated by that fact, but that she did not have photographs of her mother. She had only one and she lost it. She would never let it out of her possession, but once her bag fell from a ski lift and she lost it. And documentation of individuals before the Holocaust, it's a luxury when somebody has that. That's the first point. The second point is that the approach of Numbered is kaleidoscopic. They had more than 30 survivors that they photographed with tattoos. And I think it was the right decision to not invoke the past with any sort of, archival footage, because everything in that film is very much in the present. I won't say that Claude Lanzmann's Shoah is directly relatable to Numbered, but I will say that his insistence upon having no archival footage, no flashbacks, nothing from the past in Shoah, all 9 hours, everything is the present. That is, I believe, the strategy behind Numbered as well.
Wonderful. So Annette, we have Glenn Kurtz with us and Pinchas Gutter with us. And let's see if they are managing to unmute themselves. And just to hear from both of you, if you can unmute yourself, maybe Glenn, because your film is just very recent and getting so much attention, maybe just reflect on some of those questions that I posed to Annette and specifically the choices made in your case.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. And Tali, it's great to see you. And Annette, it's always a delight to hear you talk. I learn something every time, and I'm just grateful. Yeah, I mean, the decision of what to include in my film in some sense was reversed because there was so little to start with. We have 3 minutes of home movie footage, and that's everything. And I think in my book, and then also in Bianca's film, the approach that we took, which just happens to be very congenial to me, is rather than trying to bring in the whole story somehow, rather to dive deeply as possible into the smallest things. And of course, in my book, because this was the only evidence that I had to start with, every single thing in that film had to become, was potentially important, from the numbers on the, buildings to, the buttons on people's clothing. And the question was, is it possible to draw meaning out of each of these, details that we would normally overlook, and that in a film or a book that's trying to sort of tell the big picture, you're going to have to overlook because these are meaningless details from that perspective. And we just tried to take it from the other end and think, there's no detail that's meaningless. How much information is packed into each detail.
Yeah, and in a way, it's like a thriller, you know, to try and find out the grocery shop and what is it and the name and all the details. So it was done very successfully. Pinchas, such an honor to have you, and thank you for unmuting yourself and joining us. Pinchas, maybe reflect a little bit. I mean, you were involved in many films, and of course, you are the new dimensions in technology, the first one that students can speak to. So maybe chat to us a little bit about your thoughts of Annette's points and answers.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Annette for whatever she, her whole program that she spoke about, because it was really fascinating to listen to her. I have never listened to her before. Dorothy has, but I haven't. And I really found it extremely fascinating to listen to her talking about the different films. I have attitude towards films about the Holocaust, obviously. Now, when I was asked to go and make the first documentary to Poland with Stephen Smith, and it was called The Void, what I was interested in is to, first of all, because I'm so concerned about the veracity of my memory, is that I wanted to go and see all the fantastic things that I experienced before the war. So I went to Krakow, and I didn't go to Auschwitz. I went to Shavnica, which was the place where I spent on the mountains 6 months, recovering from pneumonia, living with Polish górale, and listening to music on Sundays. You know the story, and so forth, and to make sure that the church was still there, and even the music, which I remembered, was actually still livid in my mind. So the aspect of me, I try to first of all make sure that whatever we are going to show or I'm going to speak about is going to be absolutely correct as far as my memory was concerned. And I also wanted to experience the wonderful things that were there before the war. And when I got to Warsaw, of course, I started being terrified, because when I went to the Jewish Historical Society offices and I saw some of the pictures which I, experienced myself, it was extremely difficult. But I just want to make one point about the film about the Warsaw Ghetto that was made by the Germans. Is that life in the Warsaw Ghetto was so schizophrenic that although I started off when I came to Warsaw, from Łódź when I was 8 years old, by the time the deportations in April 19th and the uprising, which I was 3 weeks in a bunker, I was 11, that it doesn't actually, I think that the reason why they didn't finish it is because in actual fact, it was almost real, and they couldn't finish it because they felt that it was real, and that and they didn't want to show that kind of reality, because you remember when I was talking about the Warsaw Ghetto, or in some other documentary which was made by the Hebrew University, I was running around looking for bottles for my father, who was making wine from raisins on the black market. And I was standing in front of these cafes, which were quite a few of them, were collaborators or cooperators, and I don't want to judge them today, because, at the time that was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, you can't judge people for their actions, really. You can only ruminate on it, or you can make judgments without even thinking about it. So I used to stand outside these cafes, and the dead bodies were lying on the ground. And at the same time, I was watching people inside, blue police, Jewish Ordnungsdienst, the collaborators, cooperators, or whoever, the black market smugglers, which were actually a boon for the ghetto, because at least you could sell whatever you had and have some food. And they were enjoying themselves. they were having a wonderful time. They were dancing, they were singing, there was people performing. I could smell the geese being roasted. And, you know, I didn't have any to eat at home, but I was never hungry to Warsaw Ghetto. My father made sure that my sister and I, the twins, that we were not hungry. I don't know how he managed to do that, but he did that. And maybe this film Unfinished is actually a finished film as far as I'm concerned, because watching it and seeing what they did, except for certain scenes which they contrived, like the one in the mikveh and some of a few other scenes, but in actual fact that was a reality. I walked around, and if I could project, my eyes were lenses. The screen of my mind was film, and I could see those, and I can still see those films. So I think that's a very important film. That's my contribution as far as that is concerned. As far as numbers is concerned, I think it's also a very important film. I found, to me, a lot of the fictional films that have been made, some of them are really outstanding, but a lot of them are actually, I can't watch them. I find it difficult to watch them, some of the fictional films.
Thank you so much, Pinchas. It's really quite amazing to hear you reflect specifically on a film Unfinished. And Annette, maybe in the last few minutes that we have, really just your closing comments, and also, of course, responding to Glenn and Pinchas's reflections.
Well, I very much appreciate, especially Pinchas Guttorov being here, talk about having a sort of source of authenticity that relates to the films we're watching. It's the most precious thing. I guess I should maybe acknowledge that to this day, I'm profoundly aware that movies can indeed distort, they can trivialize, they can create all sorts of erroneous and potentially destructive assumptions among viewers. But I choose to believe that films are capable of moving audiences, including younger viewers, in ways that simply are not as possible in literature, theater, painting, poetry, sculpture, etc., and certainly not in dry historical material. So I have been urging I teach Holocaust cinema at Columbia University, and at the 92nd Street Y, I actually did a 4-week series in December, January online, Holocaust cinema, which was surprisingly upbeat, because as you may have gathered from my presentation, I tend to be more optimistic than overwhelmed by the weight of the material. You know, I myself, as a child of survivors, have chosen to, look at things with open, but also somewhat redemptive eyes. In other words, that there's something we can learn and use and perhaps improve, if not life, at least awareness. And so that online course was upbeat enough. They've begged me to come back. I'm doing another 4-week online Holocaust cinema series, part 2, we're calling it, in June on Sunday evenings. And I had to think long and hard about what to show, because this is a question, I think, for all of us who are educators. What do you show people, whether high school or beyond? And whereas I had focused primarily on foreign language films rather than Hollywood in my earlier one, we included Poland's Ida, for example. Now I decided to do the big ones, Schindler's List and Shoah, that's 2 weeks, but also a Hollywood film, None Shall Escape, from 1944, incredibly prescient about a post-war trial against the Nazis. I mean, it's mind-blowing. Most people don't know it. And I'm going to show Photographer, the film I mentioned earlier from Poland, that is a fascinating interrogation of memories and images. So my closing remarks would be merely that we have to be aware of the potential distortions of movies, both nonfiction and fiction, but that should never prevent us from, either as filmmakers or cinephiles, viewers, that shouldn't prevent us from embracing the possibilities that movies offer for creating sympathetic awareness among people today.
Thank you so much, Annette. And when you can give us some of the films that you mentioned, and of course we will include Glenn's a film, and Glenn just reminded us of a wonderful other film by Eric Benanski. I always break my teeth. Yeah, exactly. Warsaw, a city divided, that I watched so many times. Excellent, excellent film about Warsaw. And many other films that we can add to the list. And fantastic to have you, Pinchas, reflect about your childhood and your memories, and bringing a film unfinished to us through the eyes of a child in the Warsaw Ghetto, and your reflections. Annette, thank you. Learned so much from you. And I hope that our learning from you will happen again in the very near future. Ellen, back to you.
Absolutely. So I will formally close us out for today. Thank you very much, Annette. People are asking in the chat how they can participate in your virtual offerings that are upcoming. So we'd be very thankful if you can send that information to us, and then I can include that in the follow-up email as well. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you, as always, Talia and Esther, for facilitating this session. And thank you to our special guests, Glenn and Pinchas. It has really been a treat to have you with us. Our next session is on June 15th, featuring Dr. William Frederick Meineke Jr. on German professionals and the Holocaust. We also have an event this Sunday entitled The Cycle of Violence and Peace in Cambodia with director of the Peace in Cambodia Peace Gallery. And our post-film discussion is scheduled for June 8th, featuring the trilogy Traces, Portrait of Resistance, Survival, and Resolve. As always, the link for this series remains the same. We hope that we'll see you again next month, and then again in the fall as we continue this series. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.